Our speaker this evening is a theater artist, educator, and scholar. Amy Hughes is an assistant professor of theater at Brooklyn College. She received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from New York University, a Master's of Fine Arts from Brooklyn College, and a PhD from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Tonight's lecture is based upon her latest book, Spectacles of Reform, Theater and Activism in 19th Century America, which was published last year by the University of Michigan Press. Amy's scholarly expertise is in United States theater, visual and material culture during the 19th century, and additionally she studies theater and performance in the Republic of Turkey and specializes in collaborative learning and other non-traditional pedagogical methods. In 2009, Amy Hughes was awarded by AAS a Deborah and J. Last Fellowship to research Spectacles of Reform in the Society's collection. Please join me in welcoming back Amy Hughes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you first to Jim and to Kayla and to everyone else here at the AAS for bringing me here, bringing me back. And Paul Erickson, of course, who can't be here tonight, but who, as I'm sure many of you know, is instrumental to our work here as visiting scholars. And I just wanted to thank you as well for coming, because you are the reason why I think AAS is here in many ways, because what we as teachers and scholars do is try and generate knowledge and new thinking and new ways of seeing for people who are interested in American culture, American history, and so forth. And so I'm extremely privileged to be here tonight talking with you. And I'm going to try and keep my remarks relatively short so that we have time for discussion at the end, because I am very eager for your feedback and your questions. Just get some water. By the way, this is not my latest book, but my first book. So this is very exciting for me as well. And without the AAS and its support of emerging scholars like me, we couldn't do what we do. So another reason I'm grateful. All right. For many Americans, the word melodrama usually brings up a specific image to mind. In it, a black-clad, mustachioed villain is tying a woman to the railroad tracks. You know this? I'm going to show you a picture of it, so let me actually get that started. You're thinking it, right? Checking his work with a firm tug, he hisses something about the brilliance of his devilish plan, or perhaps the devilishness of his brilliant plan, then scurries away, disappearing into the woods. As the heroine wiggles prettily on the rails, a whistle wails thinly in the distance and the ground begins to shake. A train is approaching. Realizing she is in danger of imminent death, she calls out desperately for help. "Will no one aid me?" The tumult of the oncoming locomotive grows louder, so do her fearful cries. When it seems all hope is lost, a dashing young man appears. With a few quick movements of his dexterous hands, he unravels her bonds and removes her from harm's way, a slim second before the train rushes by in a satisfying cacophony of sound and smoke. Our heroine has been saved in the nick of time by the hero. This sensational scene in our collective imagination has in many ways come to symbolize melodrama itself, exemplifying the decadence, extremity, and excess associated with this genre. Endlessly revised and reprised, it has appeared in an astonishing variety of contexts, ranging from early film serials and animated cartoons to product advertising and music videos. For example, pop country singer Taylor Swift, some of you may have heard of her, her 2010 album, Speak Now, broke all kinds of records. She enacted the railroad rescue in both the video and the album art for her hit song, Mean. So despite the passage of time, fluctuations in taste, and the transformation of melodrama from genre to joke, the Railroad Rescue has endured, inspiring artists, humorists, and corporate entities. However, the ubiquity of this image belies a complicated, convoluted history. The version circulating today actually constitutes a flamboyant display of historical forgetfulness, as cinema scholar Nan Enstead has noted. Interesting given the subject of amnesia coming up in the video. Railroad sequences began appearing on stage and in fiction during the mid-19th century, but the scenario we recognize today first became popular in the US after Augustin Daly's melodrama, Under the Gaslight, which premiered in New York in 1867. Daly's railroad scene, which concludes the fourth act, features a man, a one-armed Civil War veteran named Snorky, tied to the tracks, who is saved from an oncoming train by the play's heroine, Laura. At the end of the scene, the exultant Snorky declares, "And these are the women who ain't to have the vote," referring to the ongoing debate about African-American male suffrage that was happening in 1867. A century and a half later, this original episode seems progressive, even feminist, when compared to the gender-correct copy circulating today, enacted by Taylor Swift, for example. What did 19th century audiences see in this sensational scene? What politics shaped and informed it? And what about Snorky's incredulous declaration, "And these are the women who ain't to have the vote"? Would the answers to such questions allow us to understand better what we see, and maybe what we need to see, in the reformed, revised representation of the railroad sequence that is instantly recognizable today? Spectacle has been a vital component of melodrama since the early work of the French playwright Pixricourt, the so-called father of melodrama, who shaped the genre in the early 1800s. Exciting effects and tableaux, which were eventually dubbed sensation scenes, enjoyed widespread popularity. And sensational aesthetics were not the exclusive domain of the theater, of course. Novelists, orators, and entrepreneurs like P.T. Barnum harnessed the power of spectacle to attract audiences and attention. Yet this century, the 19th century, also witnessed America's great age of reform. While readers and spectators increasingly sought sensational entertainment, public officials and philanthropists established institutions such as prisons, asylums, and schools designed to discipline American subjects. Activists in the temperance, abolition, and women's suffrage movements attempted to transform political and social practices. And the word normal, defined nowadays as constituting or conforming to a type or standard, or regular, usual, typical, this definition entered common usage. Before that, by the way, it was a technical term, a norm for cutting wood at the right angle. In the 1840s, we begin to see our current definition emerge. This simultaneous, rapid, and paradoxical promotion of both normalization and sensationalism signals important tensions in Western culture during this period. Some of these tensions were enacted on American stages. In the mid-1800s, thousands of theatergoers attended plays extolling the values promoted by reformers. Why were reform-minded theater managers and audiences attracted to the melodramatic mode? Or, conversely, why were producers and consumers of melodrama attracted to these politics? How did the imagery and affect embedded in these plays extend beyond the theater's walls? How did spectacle participate in that transference? In my book, Spectacles of Reform, which I notice is sitting right there, very exciting for me, in my book I investigate how and why spectacle is a crucial component of the reform apparatus and a defining characteristic of American activism. Indeed, I argue that spectacle plays a pivotal role in what I call the dramaturgy of reform. For those of you you unfamiliar with this term dramaturgy, it's a theatrical term, referring to the structural mechanics or strategies deployed in dramatic texts and in performance. I advocate for a consideration of spectacle as methodology, a unique system of communication employed in myriad contexts that rehearses and sustains conceptions of race, gender, and class in extremely powerful ways. Spectacle capitalizes on the sensational and the profane, embracing what is deliberately hidden or secretly imagined and giving it material form. Consequently, spectacle plays an instrumental role in the public and private spheres because of its potential to destabilize, complicate, or sustain different beliefs. At the same time, I wonder, where and how do activist spectacles appear before and after the theatrical encounter? This question centers on what performance studies scholar Rebecca Schneider has called performance remains, which she describes as an action repeated again and again and again, however fractured or partial or incomplete, like the railroad scene. It has a kind of staying power, persists through time, and even in a sense serves as a fleshy kind of document of its own recurrence. In my attempt to understand the cultural histories of activist images, I am not only interested in what remains, but how it remains. Why are spectacles kept alive through reinvention, revision, and repetition long after the drama is over? How are these spectacular remains interred in various archives, both documentary and texts, pictures, and objects, and in bodies like memories, flesh, or even our collective imagination? To address these questions, in my book I look at 3 of the most popular sensation scenes that appeared and reappeared throughout the 19th century. The delirium tremens, or DT's scene, in W.H. Smith's play The Drunkard, a temperance melodrama that premiered in 1844, Eliza Crossing the Ice Floes, in stage adaptations of Harry Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, first published in 1852, and the aforementioned railroad sensation in Daly's play Under the Gaslight, 1867. These spectacles, the drunkard temporarily experiencing insanity, the fugitive slave mother dashing across a river, and the heroine saving a man tied to the railroad tracks, had legs, working in tandem with visual and material culture to convey, allay, and deny urgent concerns about the rights and responsibilities of U.S. citizenship. In addition, while theaters were presenting these scenes on stage, products ranging from lithographs to children's books to decorative ceramics deployed similar scenes through illustration and ornamentation. They harnessed many of the strategies we associate with theatrical performance, suggesting that the coup de théâtre played a role in American cultural production more generally. The staged alcoholic, or drunkard, this is from a children's book I found here at the AAS. The drunkard, both in theaters and in lecture halls, is the subject of the 2nd chapter of this book. The manuscript and graphic arts collections of the AAS were crucial to my completing this chapter. Scholars have paid considerable attention to temperance propaganda, depicting dystopian visions of the drunkard's family, but performance of the DTs played an equally important role in shaping public perceptions about the dangers of drink. By examining medical texts for the period, as well as accounts of the DTs in popular culture, I discovered that physicians and lay people considered the DTs to be, essentially, a temporary episode of insanity. In harnessing the grotesque power of the DTs, dramatists, performers, and activists implicitly reinforced prescriptions of normalcy and self-discipline that emerged in America during the antebellum period. I also look at public commentary about temperance lecturer John B. Goff, some of you may have heard of him, a recovering alcoholic and temperance advocate whose meteoric rise to fame occurred in the Boston region immediately prior to and alongside Smith's play The Drunkard. His personal papers are here at the AAS, and I've spent many weeks pouring through them, and I haven't even gotten through them all yet. Luckily, he had a long career, and I only had to focus on the early part. But first, I want to share some background about this disorder, dipsomania. The DTs was described and enacted in a wide variety of venues, and the display of the out-of-control body, which posed a striking contrast to images from the temperance movement centering on the drunkard's domestic situation, became ubiquitous in temperance melodramas in the wake of Smith's play, The Drunkard. He, by the way, was co-authored by an anonymous collaborator. We think it's Reverend John Pierpont of the Pierpont family. Originally produced by Moses Kimball at the Boston Museum in 1844, this popular moral drama became, in Bruce A. McConaughey's words, the model for most subsequent dramas of dipsomania, and inspired many imitations. When P.T. Barnum presented the play at his American Museum in New York, it became the first play in American history to achieve an uninterrupted run of 100 performances. So this gives you some idea of how popular it really was with audiences. In the original staging, Smith himself played the main character, Edward Middleton. Oh, by the way, this is the manuscript side that Smith used in performing Middleton, the drunkard who suffers from the DTs. So there's a quick look. The preface to the museum's 1847 acting edition of the play asserts, Mr. Smith's personation of Edward, evidently the result of accurate and laborious study and deep knowledge of human frailty, was at times terribly real, particularly the scene of delirium tremens, which, though far short of the horrors of that dreadful malady, and appeared to those unacquainted with the disease to be overstepping the bounds of nature, was true to the letter and universally acknowledged to be the most naturally effective acting ever seen in this city. Hyperbolic, but interesting. Furthermore, according to the preface, it was no uncommon thing to see scores of men and women in the auditorium weeping like children. One reason the DTs, enacted by Smith and others, fascinated audiences is because alcoholics who made spectacles of themselves were more likely than ever during this time to be sequestered in jails and asylums. Medical texts from the period indicate that physicians considered the disorder to be a temporary episode of insanity. Despite the relatively short duration of the illness, by the mid-19th century, inebriates suffering from the DTs were often sent to asylums for treatment. Simultaneously, spectators embraced the opportunity to see representations of the unruly drunkard's body on stage. In essence, the DT scene was a riveting representation of a man gone mad that was more and more being hidden from public view. Yet the definition of dipsomania itself relied on the prescriptions of normalcy and self-discipline that were emerging in America during this time. By harnessing the grotesque power of the DT scene, dramatists, performers, and activists implicitly reinforced the orderly and efficient body privileged by respectable individuals in the urban centers. Many temperance products deployed strategies of juxtaposition, setting spectacles of indulgence in drink alongside pictures of abstinence. The Bottle, a series of images from 1847 by British artist George Cruikshank, is perhaps the most widely known 19th century depiction of the inebriate's decline and its effect on the family. The Bottle operates through comparison and contrast. The first frame, picturing a tranquil and solvent middle-class home, functions as a barometer by which later scenes of depravity are measured. As the husband and wife's drinking habit worsens, the well-appointed room is raided and rendered bare by creditors. Eventually, every family member meets a horrible end. The youngest child dies from cold, misery, and want. Shortly thereafter, the husband kills his wife in a drunken rage while their two remaining children watch. The spectacle of loss enacted in the bottle hinges in large part on the illustration of normalcy in the first plate. The markers of a happy and healthy household, comfortable furniture, decorative knickknacks, respectable clothing, smiling faces, all present here, gradually disappear. And finally, the home itself disappears. The last scene is set not in the family's house, but in an insane asylum, where the murderous and maniacal drunkard has been confined. Reformers' anxieties about the impact of alcohol on the family, as illustrated in the bottle and other visual and material media, have been studied extensively by historians of the temperance movement. However, I suggest that performances of the DTs played an equally important role in shaping public perceptions about the dangers of drink. The inebriate's depravity is most strongly signified by mental illness, as exemplified by the DTs as well as the insane asylum depicted in the bottle. After all, the final scene here, it depicts the protagonists of the series suffering a permanent state of mania. Although temperance lecturer John B. Goff was never institutionalized for drunkenness, he had first-hand knowledge of its effects. Goff was a reformed drunkard inspired and supported by the Washingtonians, a short-lived but highly influential temperance organization focusing on working-class alcoholics. By 1843, Washingtonian strategies of reclamation and mutual support had spread to such a degree that the society claimed more than 1 million converts. According to temperance scholar Thomas Pegram, their efficacy owed much to its willingness to provide a popular culture of temperance for working-class people. Dances, picnics, minstrel shows, concerts, and other amusements numbered among their offerings. So did charismatic orators. Goff was one such orator. In his performances, Goff did, in essence, one-man, melodramatic sensation scenes, virtual tableau that amused, saddened, moved, and horrified his spectators. Many dimensions of his career, the anecdotal and the actual, the public and the private, helped to illuminate why the delirium tremens played a prominent role in antebellum entertainment culture. After becoming sober in the wake of an encounter with a Washingtonian, Goff began telling his story at Washingtonian meetings publicly in 1842. He was a different sort of spectacle, odd, anomalous, a curiosity. Indeed, he seems to have had what theater scholar Joseph Roach terms it, the peculiar charisma we perceive in what Roach describes as abnormally interesting people. In myriad ways, Goff embodied the paradoxical qualities of strength and vulnerability, innocence and experience, and singularity and typicality that Roach describes in describing what this quality it is. Goff was only 25 years old when he started speaking, and many witnesses of his first performances described feeling shocked and surprised by his youth. Middle-class audiences viewed him as relatively innocent due to his lack of polish and education. He never finished school, coming from an impoverished family. And yet he also had a wealth of experience as a former drunkard, which not only informed his lecturers, but also gave him a kind of authority. Such contradictions can be detected in the many newspaper clippings that Goff collected in his personal scrapbooks, which are here. Spectators genuinely struggled to pinpoint what made him so compelling. A writer in the Flushing Journal once lamented, "It needs a more competent hand than mine to give anything like a sketch of the speaker's fire and power. One must be present, as in a battle or a shipwreck, to be able to form a just idea and estimation of such things." More than anything, the newspaper clippings reveal that his admirers considered his lectures to be not only effective, but affective. Goff's appeal seemed to center on two talents, his power of imitation and his ability to generate breathless moments of emotional collectivity in his audiences. But another mystery attracted spectators too. As Baz Kershaw asserts, one of the defining features of spectacle is the simultaneous curiosity and contempt it tends to inspire among us. In many ways, Goff trafficked in this paradoxical dynamic. Suspicions about whether or not he was truly reformed dogged him throughout his life. Such questions plagued many Washingtonian speakers who collectively constituted a new class of lecturers, a departure from the clergymen and physicians that tended before this time to circulate in these temperance communities. Simultaneously attracted and repulsed by him, fans and foes wondered if the drunkard before them was genuinely rehabilitated. Goff's public testimonials gave inquisitive spectators an opportunity to read the truth, if they could, upon his body. Perhaps not surprisingly, critics frequently compared him to famous actors. For example, a writer for the Commercial Advertiser likened Goff's oratory to theatrical performance. Quote, "I have listened to some of the greatest tragic actors of the time when theaters were in fashion, but none of them in the highest wrought scenes of Shakespeare could ever move my feelings as they were moved by that son of nature in his simple lectures in favor of temperance." Whether intentionally or not, such comparisons alluded to a somewhat embarrassing detail in the orator's past. Before taking the pledge of sobriety, he worked for a time as a professional actor, including short stints at the Franklin Theater in New York City and the Lion Theater in Boston. Because Goff tended to speak extemporaneously, it is impossible to identify textual ties between his version of the DTs and that of Smith's. However, newspaper accounts frequently mention that one of Goff's most effective bits was his vivid portraiture of the horrors of the DTs, which the Princeton Whig declared to be the masterpiece of the whole performance. The whole assembly stood aghast. Another testimony regarding Goff's rendition of the DTs similarly emphasizes the sensational bodily nature of his spectators' response. He made the flesh to creep with horror, as he described with startling distinctness the horrible terror, the dreadful, terrible inflictions of that intensely terrifying disease. So many terrors, right? The delirium tremens, the last stage of the drunkard's terrible career. Since Goff was admired for his gift of imitation, investing, according to the pilot in Boston, his whole soul into his representations of character, it is probable that during these moments, the lecturer created a scene that had something in common with the DT scenes in The Drunkard, which premiered the same year that he was starting out in Boston. In fact, that year when The Drunkard premiered, he had 40 lectures in Boston. Indeed, Goff's rendition of the DTs, which became one of his most popular routines, may have inspired Smith, I think, to include such a scene in his temperance drama. Platform Echoes, a collection of Goff's oratorical texts first published in 1884, provides additional evidence that the DTs played a prominent role in his lectures and legend. The illustrated title page depicting the beginning, middle, and end of a drunkard's career features 4 images. Representing the middle, located immediately beneath Goff's name on the title page, is a man battling snakes and demons during a bout of the DTs, suggesting that this spectacle was indeed strongly associated with him. By 1845, Goff had obtained celebrity status, with newspapers in most major eastern cities regularly reporting his activities and whereabouts. During an engagement in New York City in September, he disappeared for a week and was eventually discovered in a brothel on Walker Street. This is 2 years into his career, suffering from the effects of the DTs. The news sparked a veritable firestorm of criticism, with publications like the Police Gazette and the Herald leading the charge. Goff distributed a statement claiming that a stranger invited him to engage in conversation over a glass of soda water and somehow drugged or poisoned him. Apparently, the proffered concoction whetted Goff's appetite for drink and caused an uncontrolled spiral that ended in a house of ill repute. The voluminous press coverage about this scandal in Goff's scrapbook suggests that the public followed the story with intense interest. Supporters and detractors alike participated in the debunking of the popular mythology that had formed around him. The lecture's alleged humbugging of the public, as the Gazette asserted on at least one occasion, was of particular concern. This public discourse about Goff's relapse confirms that the sensational drunkard, in both oratory and melodrama, derived its capital from the slippage between storied past and actual present. As Roach argues, an audience's attraction to celebrity relies in part on the performer's vulnerability, on, quote, the empathic tension of waiting for the apparently inevitable fall, which makes for breathless spectatorship. Temperance speakers like Goff fascinated audiences because each reformed drunkard might someday fall again, stumbling spectacularly from normalcy into disorder. For them, disaster perpetually loomed, one step or one drink away. Antebellum temperance discourse and iconography tended to spectacularize normalcy and deviance, setting them side by side. This is one example of a pledge card by the Total Abstinence Society, not in this collection, this is in the New York Historical Society. And in the corners, you can see these contrasting scenes. Here we have temperance, the happy family, in their living room. And here we have intemperance, but a scene of violence against the wife. Horrifying and grotesque, the DTs served as sensational evidence of the man's objection, his deplorable failure to stay within the boundaries of middle-class normalcy. Through the adoption of the Teetotalers' Pledge, working and middle-class activists endorsed and reinforced the restrained, disciplined body as a universal common denominator for all Americans. So, somewhat paradoxically, it seems that sensational depictions of dipsomania played an important role in the construction of the normal body during the early and mid-19th century. In melodramas, lectures, and pictorial media, the DTs revealed the spectacular consequences of departing from the norm. Essentially, the madman helped to define the rational man. As such, the DT scene was a conservative spectacle, even though it was affected through excess and melodrama. Reformers employed sensational tactics to advance their cause, but they nevertheless communicated a mandate of restraint. Of course, renditions of the delirium tremens were temporary and fleeting, constituting just a few moments in a relatively long performance. But the sensationalism of the DT's sequence derived from the audience's belief that such scenes occurred in the real world. It increasingly appeared in lecture halls and theaters at a time when new concepts of normativity were emerging. Physicians and activists conceived the DTs as a kind of temporary insanity and perhaps even more importantly, a manifestation of moral deviance. Reformers employed many images to advance the temperance cause, especially pictures of the drunkard's ragged family, but through spectacles of insanity, dramatists, performers, and activists reinforced the orderly middle-class ideals in a powerful and visceral way. Thank you so much for having me here and for listening and for laughing. And I look forward to your questions.